What kind of distribution do we see in the rates of extreme population globally? Well, this map gives us a sort of color coding indication, and it helps us to understand at least part of the picture of poverty in the world. So, as you can see, 50% or greater, 40 to 50%, the vast majority of countries that fall into this category are here in Africa. Africa is definitely the region that has the highest levels of extreme poverty per capita. Now, India used to be the country that had the highest level of per capita poverty, but they've been actively reducing it. And as a result, India has significantly lowered their extreme poverty levels over the last, I'd say, maybe decade. Now, there's a fairly high rate here in areas around the Pacific Rim and a couple of areas in South America. And then there's, less extreme levels in China, Brazil, Mexico, and even some parts of Africa. So there are countries that have much lower levels than these really bad areas. This map is a little misleading, however, because all these green areas here that are reporting 0, that's probably just failure to report any extreme poverty. So those numbers are probably just not real numbers, and hence we don't really have a good picture of these areas. The areas in gray are areas that won't report at all. All right? So areas in green, I would pessimistically say lie. The areas in gray simply don't tell you. And then we have these areas in Western Europe, North America, Australia, that are called high-income economies. And what does that mean? Well, that means that conventionally speaking, people don't think of these places as having extreme poverty. Practically speaking, though, at least in the United States, there is actually a significant amount of extreme poverty, as we'll see. And so, in a way, this map is a little bit misleading, though it does give us some idea, at least for a lot of the world, what the distribution of extreme poverty really is. But what about less extreme poverty? Poverty that isn't immediately life-threatening, but that affects the quality of life, the life expectancy, and so on of people who fall into that category. Well, in 2005, researchers estimated that approximately 56.6% of the world's population lived in a slightly higher category, $2.50 indexed to 2011 in the United States per day or less. So if you raise the quantitative cap up 60 cents, you go from somewhere around 11% to somewhere around 57%. And so this is a severe poverty. This is a poverty where you're probably having prolonged scarcity of resources, at least one, over the course of your life. A less severe poverty would be a poverty that's indexed to $10 a day or less, indexed to 2011 in the United States. And the 2011 Pew Research Center report estimated that approximately 71% of the world lived on $10 a day or less. Now, this is still poverty. This is still people who experience scarcity, either intermittent scarcity or scarcity over a prolonged period, but not severe enough to be life-threatening, or just with regard to one basic human need or two basic human needs, but not across a wide spectrum of human needs. Now, the U.S. Census defines poverty in the United States, indexing it to states and to the number of individuals in a household. But a sort of rule of thumb that is used is poverty levels are for a family of 4 across states is usually fixed at about $25,100 a year, or about $17.19 per person per day in current US dollars. And that's the estimate of poverty for the United States. Now, you might say, oh, 17.9, that's more than 10, more than 250, right? That's significantly high, but the cost of living is much higher in the United States than it is, say, in Bangladesh. And so that $17.19 of US dollars in 2017 isn't, the same amount of resources that $2.50 gets you at the Horn of Africa. And in fact, in the 2014 census, 14.8% of U.S. citizens were classified as living in poverty. Now that number dropped to 12.7% in 2016. Now 12.7% of the U.S. population translates to about 40.6 million people. So it's not a small number, actually, because the U.S. is the 3rd most populous country in the world. We have about 326 million, 327 million citizens. So 12% is still a huge number of individuals. And in fact, a UN report that came out, I believe, in 2017 from the UN Organization on Human Rights found that about 40 million U.S. citizens, I'm quoting from the report, live in poverty, and 18.5 million in extreme poverty, and 5.3 million live in third world conditions of absolute poverty. And that 5.3 million, what does that mean? How should we understand that? Well, these are people that don't have, plumbing. They don't have sanitation facilities. They don't have regular access to food and potable water and so on, right? They live the way the poorest people in, some of the poorest countries in the world live. Now, when the Organization of Human Rights delivered this report, there was an uproar in the United Nations, and then UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, under the Trump administration, protested this report and denied the findings and so on. And there was such an uproar and debate that in 2018, the U.S. became the only country to ever withdraw from the United Nations Organization for Human and Civil Rights, and since it was founded in 2006. So this illustrates that difficult to gather data on poverty, and it's also difficult to get countries to acknowledge data that you've collected and to do anything about it. Right? So since that UN report was passed, I believe the tax cuts have kicked in that disproportionately cut the taxes of the upper 1% of Americans and don't do anything for this 18.5 million in extreme poverty at all.